this meeting of the Round Rock Independent School District Board of Trustees to order. It's June 21st, 2018 at 6 p.m. Call this meeting to order. We have a full quorum. We are going to move to item C, public hearing, proposed 2018-19 budget and tax rate. Dr. Flores.
Thank you, Madam President. We are excited to make one final presentation from all CFO and state taxes, Mr. Randy Staats. So I want to talk for 20 years of doing outstanding matters. So before I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Board members, Dr. Flores. It's been my pleasure to serve you all in the community for the last 20 years. It's a great district for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, the educational process that's provided, but certainly from the financial and operational side, excellence as well. So really enjoyed working with you all and appreciate it very much. Tonight's presentation is a culmination of 6 months worth of work with you all with 4 different workshops, and it's actually a public hearing, so you'll have the opportunity to take some public input in the process as well. This is the notice that was published in the Round Rock Leader on June the 7th, 2 weeks ago, and this is required through state law to come up with these calculations. And now that we no longer have our tax office, the Williamson County Tax Office does these calculations for us based on data and information we provide for them, but also data from appraisal districts in both Williamson and Travis County. One thing to point out for you at the very top, it talks about tax rate, and so we are sharing with you that we'll adopt the same tax rate as we had the previous year, $1.04 on maintenance and operations, and 0.2648 on debt service. I want to commend you all again for the last 3 years. You've really taken proactive action to pay down debt early, and you did that again last month. And that maintains the same tax rate, but it really helps to reduce the overall debt burden and continue preparing yourselves for the ongoing growth that continues to happen in Round Rock. Another thing to note, and kind of in the bottom quadrant, is the increase in the average taxable value of residents. And so it's about up a little over $17,000, which is a lower increase than the last year, both in terms of dollars and in terms of percentage increase. So again, we're continuing to see a little bit of a slowdown in the growth, but it's still there from an individual taxpayer perspective. This worksheet shows the changes that occurred from your last workshop on June the 7th. You'll see that change column shows 0. So I really want to move right over to the next worksheet, which shows the original budget that we're proposing tonight for 2018-19 in comparison to the original budget at this time last year. And you can really see the changes a little bit easier that way. You show an increase in current tax collections of over $27 million and an increase in state revenue of over $12 million. Remember, that comes from, now next year will be the second year of the biennium, and so that increase comes from that available school fund that we talked about last month and the textbooks fund as well. So overall, you show an increase in revenues of $42 million. On the expenditure side of things, taking a look at salaries, you have salaries of $361.7 million. That does include the salary increases of 2% that you provided and approved last month. And then down towards the bottom, you see Chapter 41 recapture payments increasing by $22.5 million. And that is a direct result of the increase in property values, but primarily, remember that calculation is primarily using values from last year. And so much of that is the increase that occurred last year and will continue to increase in the future years. From an individual taxpayer perspective, an individual taxpayer is paying a little bit over $3,100 towards the maintenance and operation component, and $277 of that will go towards the Chapter 41 recapture payment. So that's a pretty substantial increase from the prior year where it was projected around $85. You're continuing to see an increase in that contribution, and you will for many years as values continue to climb. All that being said, if you look at the total bottom line, we had a deficit budget last year of $14.8 million, and that is being reduced to $4.4 million based on the additional revenues that we're projecting for next year. This is a summary slide of all of the different budgets that are included within your adoption this evening. The ones that are actually required by statute to be approved is general operating, 199, the food service fund, 240, and debt service, 599. So you see that deficit that we talked about a moment ago, $4.4 million. But if you take a look at debt service, and remember that expenditures run a little bit different timeline than your revenue. So expenditures represent that debt service payment in August, and then again in February, whereas your revenues are actually generating revenue for the February payment in August of next year. So that's why you always see a little bit of a difference there in terms of whether it's positive or negative. So that's not a negative thing to have a deficit in debt service. In terms of capital projects, remember those bond proceeds and revenues from those bond proceeds were actually received and accounted for in previous fiscal years. And so while it looks like there's a deficit there, really that's just the spend down of bond 2014 and a little bit of funds from bond 2008 that are remaining. And then in the internal service fund, remember this was the first year we kind of set aside the print services to be set aside as an enterprise fund or an internal service fund. To be able to continue to provide those services to campuses and departments. But so you see a deficit there, and we shore that up at the end of the year with the transfer from general operating. The only way to balance that would be to increase the cost associated with print service jobs, and really what that does is just reduce the buying power of departments and campuses, because those are the folks that are paying for them. And then our self-funded health insurance plan. You see a deficit there. We made some changes this year, and hopefully those will continue to pay dividends for us in future years, but might not be as immediate as we had hoped. This slide shows the different breakdown and descriptions of the different functions. Remember, you're required by a TA statute to adopt budget based on function codes. Of course, in Round Rock, we break it out a little bit further beyond the function codes. We also break it out into object codes as well. Or account codes to a greater degree. So you see that as an example in functional 11. You see a greater degree of breakdown as opposed to just showing that total instruction line. Okay, and so you can peruse through that, but I want to stop at this last page and just reiterate to you. We talked at the May workshop about the changes that were happening as a result of Senate Bill 622, and it requires kind of a separation of the cost associated with posting public notices that are required by statute. And so the biggest change there from 1718 to 1819 is actually you didn't have an election in 1718. And so you didn't have to post a notice of election, but we're projecting to being able to have a need to do that this year because of the trustee election in November. So that's the biggest change there. And then there's some supporting documentation at the back. These are the different funds that break out into the revenues and expenditures that you'll be approving this evening. And at the very back, we've got our budget calendar that you're working through. Of course, the actual adoption of tax rate does not occur until September. After you received final notice from TEA that allows you to set the tax rate, and you have to do that, you have to first adopt the purchase of attendance credits for Chapter 41 in advance of adopting the tax rate. That will happen in August. A breakdown of campuses and departments and library allocations here. And then a final slide on some tax information shows that growth of 8.6% in the property values, greater than $36.6 million in taxable property for 18-19. And I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Madam President. I just really wanted a few comments today to make sure you all some clarifications. Where am I still high up?
No, sound like it.
First, Randy, thank you for this, and also thank you for all your years of service. We really
Yes, sir.
appreciate you, the work you do to help us get to this point. That's a big deal. But I'm looking at this, and I want to make sure I understand this right. So recap is going to be about 32 million, right?
Yes, sir.
And up there on the posting, we're seeing that on the average home, average home in our district, the total taxes due being a little under 4,000. I'm doing the math in my head, and that's about 8,000 homes in our district, but those dollars aren't staying locally. They're going back to state taxes. I'm thinking that right. $4 to $31 million. Yeah, that's concerning. So I think I know that number is going to keep going up. And I know Mr. Matt we got a very good illustration of this in one of our workshops of how our budget keeps going down. So I think I say all that really just for the public's information to see that when you look at our budget, our hard costs they went up less than inflation, about 2%. So every other increase is going to pay that $32 million bill in state tax.
That's correct.
And that's just very concerning to me that, again, so this highlights me. We got to work with our legislative orders. We got to talk to them and make sure they see this, they understand it. We got to talk to our homeowners, make sure they understand it, so we can try and find a true, equitable funding solution for us. Because this is just not a sustainable model.
Right, I agree.
In future years, the budget's going to be less than what we traditionally.
That's correct. That's correct. And it goes back to the original intent of Chapter 41, and it was really to pull out those really high property wealthy districts. But as you know, throughout the last 25 years, the number of districts that have actually fallen into Chapter 41 has increased substantially. And so, the whole argument now is whose responsibility really is it to shore up property poor districts? Is it really those like Round Rock that are property wealthy, or is it the state's responsibility to do that? Certainly, the educational expectations of the community here in Round Rock might be higher than other districts, and that requires some additional funds.
I hope people are watching and listening can help us get that narrative out there, and the fact that really what's causing this increase is state funding.
Correct.
All other expenditures are staying relatively consistent with inflation.
Correct.
And I will let everyone know we are having some problems with our microphones. So if you could speak louder when you're talking, and we're going to use these microphones, and they're working on them through the hearing, and they'll be continuing to get them ready for when we go back in. So I do apologize.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions, board members? And I do appreciate pointing that out, because I think that message does get lost sometimes. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you once again for allowing me to serve you for all these years. Appreciate it.
And Randy, while you're here, board members, if you can all kind of come around to the front. We all just mentioned that it's Mr. Staats, I would say Boston, but his last evening with us.